Scheduled a meeting on the ENIAC. Press Eckert, who was supposed to present his perspective of it, was unable to present it, and Dr. Mauchly agreed to present his paper. In order to give some variety, they decided to substitute Dr. Burke's paper on that day and reschedule Dr. Mauchly's presentation of the Eckert perspective for this morning. I was at Los Alamos in 1944 when John von Neumann told us of the very exciting developments at the Moore School of the electronic digital computer ENIAC being built, and of the very exciting ideas that Mauchly and Eckert had on storing the program for automatically sequencing the operations on storage devices such as mercury delay lines, which are used in the radar projects, and their plans for making an automatic computer on this. And that helped get me interested in the area of computers. And so it was a great pleasure that I introduced Dr. Mauchly. Since he was introduced on the previous days, I will not give him a long introduction, but just call on this one-time meteorologist turned computer developer, John Mauchly.
Thank you. The one-time meteorologist had a chance at breakfast to say something about the effects of the moon on the weather. We will immediately avoid that topic here. Those who want to discuss it should see me privately. I have a lot to do here in behalf of my absent partner. I was asked by him to deliver his thoughts to you, and he regrets not being able to make it here. He asked me to take liberties with what he wrote, if desirable, and I've taken a few, but I will try not to take ones which will give you any wrong impressions, we'll say. Those of you who know him will understand that if you ask him questions, it's something like trying to drink from a fire hose. I'm indebted to that remark, for that remark, to Mr. Cleaver, who was here earlier in this conference and had to leave. And it was a very apt analogy. At any rate, he was very interested in getting things done, and so if you did ask him questions, why you got usually more than you wanted to know about elephants or whatever it was that you asked. Now, let me take up the speech which he has left with us, and I will try to supplement if I think it necessary. The computer circuits that were used in the ENIAC have, as has been noted several times before, been very similar to some of the circuits used by the cosmic ray physicists and others in developing what they call scaling circuits for counting. And the connections with radar come later in the development of a storage device from a delay line of the acoustic type. Some people seem to attribute all of the derivation, all of the back technology as due to radar, which is not at all true. Now, the main thing, however, with the ENIAC was to develop a control system. And in fact, you'll find in the history which Goldstein has written, they remark to the effect that when he met von Neumann, as he was about to, that he would know the depth of von Neumann's perception by what was the first question he asked. He asked about some other things, like how fast does it work or something. Why, thumbs down on that. But if he asked how it was controlled, what was the logic of it, then he'd know that von Neumann was a real wise man. And that's what happened when Neumann did ask things like that. And so there was immediately a nice rapport built up when we finally did have von Neumann come to the Moore School. But there's a story before that. We ourselves in the ENIAC had to figure out how we were going to have a control flexible enough to do all the things which we wanted to do and which other people, like the astronomer Cunningham, insisted should be taken into the scope. It is unfortunately often said that the ENIAC was just built for doing firing tables. I don't think anybody's going to shoot us now for saying that we misappropriated government money, because it was Leland Cunningham in particular, but others also at the Ballistic Research Laboratory, who said, we don't want to spend our money for something which is special purpose. Yes, we want firing tables, but we also want to do interior ballistics rather, as well as exterior. We want to do all kinds of data reduction, and they went on and on with examples of things which they would hope to get done if they bought a computer which was sufficiently flexible. Well, so I always wince a little when people refer to the ENIAC as a special purpose device. It was special purpose in its name, of course, as part of the sales program. We had to sell the Pentagon the idea that this would integrate and compute the firing tables, which were the real crux at the moment. Now, lots of good things have been stopped in this world before they should have been, because somebody made bad experiments. The experiments didn't work, so you forget about it for a while. Fortunately, we avoided that in the ENIAC, and so we were able, by a lot of good, well, I would say it was kind of a set of rules which you could call a discipline, mainly due to Eckert's knowledge and experience and understanding of the problems of using fallible things like vacuum tubes for things that had to be as infallible as possible. Due to those things, why, we fortunately did not fall into any deep traps, and our first device, the ENIAC, did indeed do what we wanted, and in some respects even more. It was gratifying to see the way it went together and how it tested out. Parenthetically, I myself was involved in some of the tests on what we call the two-accumulator system, in which we ran problems which were second-order difference equations of the kind that could be run on just two accumulators with distributed control as we elected. And it was just at that point that when Neumann came on the scene for a demonstration. It was just at that point also when Harold Pender and Dr. Brainerd and others suddenly, I think, felt a load slip off their shoulders because they had been taking a great risk in view of all of the negative flack, you might say, from other institutions who didn't think that playing around with vacuum tubes was the way to go yet. Well, the vacuum tube was originally, the ENIAC was originally intended to have 5,000 tubes, a bit scary. But we went ahead and we wound up, as you know, with about 18,000 of these rather fallible devices in the ENIAC. And of course, part of this growth was due to expansions of requirements. In other words, as Cunningham and others saw what we were doing and how we were going about it, they said, we don't want just one of these function tables to put in drag functions. Maybe for that really flexible general purpose device, we ought to have 3. And so they wanted more accumulators too, more 10-digit storage devices, things of that sort. And the result of this was to make the requirements of what was to be built double or more, and the estimated money double or more, and the time it took a little longer, of course. And so all record can say here is that if we had built it according to the original specifications when the contract was first let, it hadn't been amplified as to amount of equipment, why, it probably would have been built with 6,000 tubes, which isn't badly off from the 5,000 that he estimated originally. Now, the cost of 150,000 originally estimated became 400,000. Again, well, considering the expansion, and a lot of that money went into hardware once we established what the modular design was going to be, that's not bad either. But the big problem now is that flexibility of programming. And if I were saying this for myself now, I would have to outline my whole life history, as was done by Dr. Svoboda, I guess, to say, where did I get any of the kinds of information to tell us what we needed for flexible programming? But that, again, is a long story we'll skip. The main idea right now is to compare this with a little bit with what was being done elsewhere. Eckert compares, first of all, with a differential analyzer. Well, we had one at the Moore School. And so there are certain setup times and things and ways of doing things there which one could, by analogy, carry over to how you do set up a problem on the ENIAC. However, one of the strong points that Eckert is making here is that the ENIAC was nicely equipped with the ability to handle subroutines. Now, I don't offhand remember anything in the differential analyzer which I would make an analogy to there. There were all sorts of ways of handling subroutines through the device which I was the main person specifying, namely what we call a master programmer, which enabled you to do all kinds of loops and cutbacks to the main routine and so forth, which in turn means it could do nested subroutines, not just one subroutine and forget about what else you can do. The Harvard Mark I couldn't do a subroutine as it was originally built. And when they did supply the extra facility with paper loops to be read for subroutines, I believe that you could only really have as many subroutines as they provided loop readers, unless you stopped the program and inserted other loops. I may be wrong about that, but that would just show that I'm not fully equipped with all the knowledge needed on Harvard Mark I. Anyway, we as I say, I think should be particularly proud of the fact that we did have this flexible programming. And we did not hamper the people who wanted to put programs on. And if you look at a list of the things that were done on the EDVAC, you will see that it far transcended the special purpose, if you want to call it that, of computing exterior ballistic range tables. Then we had other problems, of course, which hardly need mentioning, I think. We had to be sure that pulses got from here to there in the machine, proper time and so forth. And so there were 60 feet long lines shielded with little boxes, and we were quite concerned about this problem at the time. We actually overkilled it. But nevertheless, the machine did work as a machine in which you could carry on several processes simultaneously. It was a multiprocessing device as well as a parallel device. And there were various things available, and to the programmer or programming groups, which makes this, in that sense, a pretty modern device. Now this control, though, also included the idea of distributed control. Why? Well, it was really ease of building and getting it done in proper time, and not knowing at the outset whether someone would say, oh, we need more of this or more of that. And that would make the redesign tough if certain kinds of central control were used. And with the distributed control, which I won't describe now, just to mention the fact that there are these things. You can look them up. There's plenty of information. What we need here is a consideration of this machine in a proper light, a proper context, with this flexibility of what words you use for what, as I suggested in my own talk. Got the people mixed up here. My meaning John Mauchly's talk suggested some of this flexibility. Now I'm giving Eckert's talk. Well, we wanted to make these things as general in nature, and we were worried as we were going ahead with the ENIAC about what generality we did or did not have in that machine. And of course, we were looking forward to an improved machine. What would we do next? We didn't know where the money had come from, but we hoped. And so, one of the things, Eckert says, one of the things that worried us was the generality of how many different kinds of storage devices did we have in that machine? We had too many, we thought. There were storage devices of cables, of course, and things of that sort, particularly for the programming end. There were also storage devices, high-speed electronic ones, and the master programmer, mainly, again, for programming. There were other storage devices called function tables, which are settable, read-only memories, things of that sort. And I could even list some others called constant transmitters and so forth. But the main idea here is that it seemed, as Eckert says here, it seemed that how would we build the next machine? How would we know? You'd have to know which problems are going to work, what kind of problems they were, if you start having your storage be very special and say we need this much of this and that much of that. So we're looking for some way to avoid that problem. That was about January 44 when we had time to consider that, because the design for the ENIAC had been pretty well set, and we were at that time watching it go together, you might say, and being sure that it was tested correctly. And at the same time, Eckert and I were having long talks in the evening. See, who am I now? I mean, Mauchly and I were having long talks in the evening as to what better we could do and how would we do it. And So there we have a concern which had to do with storage. And it was this point that Eckert says, well, he'd been working on a delay line for radar purposes previous to his work on the ENIAC. And on account of that, he thought of a device which might result from feedbacking on the delay and continuing to store for longer periods of time. That would avoid us, if we could have as much storage as we want, with much cheaper rates, of course, it would avoid some of these problems that we're talking about. And so that was one problem. And the other one was the setup time, which was mentioned before. That the manual setting up of cables, things of that sort, it was so bad, in fact, that it took us longer to set up our fast, high-speed computer than sometimes to set up the slow differential analyzer. How do you cope with that? And Eckert said, well, all of these instructions and ways of setting up were always written down in some fashion in numbers. And these are all numbers. We ought to be able to not only write such numbers on a piece of paper, we ought to be able to put them as input to the computer. And now, if we had that cheap storage, we could store the instructions. When was this? 1944, January. And so, perhaps it's time to show you the first slide in which that concept was written down. Now, I doubt if anybody over there would be able to read much of this, except, in fact, possibly the first row. But I will just point out that it was more or less in the form of a disclosure about a magnetic drum calculator in which you could input numbers or whatever data and store on a drum. But that drum had some etched channels in which you could put bootstrap routines or whatever you needed, timing signals, something that you'd rather not have erased and have there available anytime. And on the other hand, it had what he called, I've forgotten now what the thing was. At any rate, some kind of an easily magnetic, soft magnetic material, permalloy, for instance, might be put on so that you could erase and restore and that is, put on new kinds of data, including instructions. That was January 44. It is a strange fact that after this was written down by Eckert, it sort of got lost. Nobody seemed to remember it anymore. He finally got it back, and the original was finally obtained, and he had it redone, and we witnessed it, redated it, and so forth. But I had seen it in January 44. He knew he'd written in January 44, and all of that material, although the written form was lost for a long time, and apparently only recovered when one of the lawyers was combing through files at the War School for the legal trials that were going on. That material existed all the time. As a sort of a check on this, I asked Harry Husky yesterday, when he came to the Moore School in, I think, April 44 or something of the sort, had he heard about any notions that we would store instructions in some kind of a computer storage if we had a cheap enough one. And Harry said, well, yes, Eckert told me about that. And my immediate reaction was, why didn't I think of that? Well, that's the way it goes. Because a question that can well come up and be debated forever, perhaps, is how obvious are some ideas? Why didn't he think of it? I don't know. Why didn't Goldstein think of it? Because the next thing I'm going to point out is, if you read a lot of material which is nicely documented in Goldstein's book, lots of footnotes, lots of dates, you'll find that he was writing to Gillen and others about this new Mercury delay line and how they wanted to fund it, get another project started. And then at about the same time, or even later, he was talking about, we're going to do something in a new machine about automatic programming. We think that relays will be just fine for setting the switches and the constant tables and everything, instead of what we've been doing, and we ought to be able to operate those from a paper tape. And yet, in that same chapter, I believe, he carefully points out that the people at the Moore School, and that means Mauchly and Eckert and some others, were all aware at that time that instructions to a computer could be coded onto a paper tape, for instance, and fed into something like a relay computer, why not an electronic computer, and so on. The only bar to all this really was the economic one of how much would it cost to produce enough storage of fast electronic type to make this a feasible thing to do. Rationally and intellectually, it was an obvious idea. So here were some of us talking about this kind of a thing before Goldstein had written this memo about we're going to have automatic programming and we're going to store things in relays probably. And also, of course, he wouldn't have done that if that other logician had appeared soon enough. The other logician being von Neumann, whom he met at a railroad station, and who, according to the records that we can obtain from the security people and so forth, had his first clearance to visit the ENIAC in September of 1944. The next slide, I think, is the end of this thing with dates and things on it, and a little more information. As I say, you can't read that, so I'll just say there is such a thing. This is one copy. There's another copy, the recovered earlier copy is also found and available. And now the next slide is the thing which the legal boys had dug up to show that von Neumann and Dr. Alessandra from the Institute were allowed to come and talk about and look in on the ENIAC and things of that sort. And that is September 7th, I believe. I also, now Mauchly that is, has a confirmation of that September 7th date in that at the same time, around September 44, I was spending a day or so a week at the Naval Ordnance Laboratory working for a man named Atanasov who was a computer dropout, as he had no interest at that point in working on computers. And I told them there, and I have a memo on that to that effect in my files, that I had to be back at the Moore School on the 7th of September because a very interesting man was coming. Dr. von Neumann was going to look in on this, and I wanted to be there. And of course, when I was there, why, one of the things we did was to show him the two accumulator model, and he took off like a real rocket then. And the next section that Eckert is writing here has to do with how well von Neumann learned what was going on. And so we described our ideas to Neumann in 1944, and that's after the 9th of September. And you couldn't have found a more receptive person. He immediately began to concern himself with some of the logical, but not the electronic details of the problem. He was particularly interested in an instruction code for this machine, which we called the EDVAC then. Well, we had, as I say, been laying these plans since January, actually, as to how we were going to use this, but we didn't have any written up reports. So we described these things to him on the blackboard, and he just raced ahead. One of the aptest learners I ever knew. And Eckert says, later when Neumann and I struck up a long conversation on whether it was better to have 1, 2, or 3 addresses in the instructions, whether it was better to store 1 or 2 instruction codes per word, things of that type. And I went up to MIT to see the new differential analyzer, which was set up from paper tape. This was called the Caldwell machine at that time. And as we were sitting at the last row of the auditorium up there, why, we spent most of the time talking on whether minimum latency coding would be practical in the EDVAC. Whether we could arrange the timing of things in such a way as to cut down the waiting time to a number in the proposed Mercury tank memory. I didn't notice that before. I don't understand it. But cut down the waiting time to a number, at any rate, to get less loss of time in what was then called latency. When Neumann decided it was too difficult to program and could not be done in a practical situation, as we see it, he was not right. Grace Hopper used minimum latency coding, figured out a practical way of doing it, first with hand charts which she prepared. Later, she used the UNIVAC itself to work out the details of the memory locations. Well, that's akin to a lot of our philosophy at that time, of course. Use the UNIVAC, use the computer to do all that tedious, dirty work if you can possibly do it. And that was the origin of all these languages, interpreters, and all the other things that we're going to talk about. So, then the other thing was the size of the memory. We could have gotten a much larger memory about the same cost had we effectively used this minimum latency approximation and things. And also we discussed with Van Neumann the idea about parallel machines, and of course his machine became a parallel machine. But I was influenced by Bell Relay, says Eckert, and by my work on the electrostatic storage tube. So, considering parallel machines, the problem there was that we didn't know how to build a good parallel memory yet. So I worked on a storage input device at the University of Pennsylvania, which was modeled on the ideas of an iconoscope. And of course, some of the people that saw that were like F.C. Williams of England, and you know his history. The work of John Mauchly and I were doing was under a security classification of confidential. We weren't allowed to go out and give unapproved talks. So Eckert is saying, and I've felt badly about this myself, that when we were under the, what we believe were security restrictions that we didn't know how to cope with or what to do about, why there were other people who apparently did not feel so constrained. And but even worse than that, I think, was the fact that when Van Neumann had some free time at Los Alamos to work on what was now his greatest toy, writing up the logic of computers, why, He claimed that what he was doing was to write up the product of the group effort in which he had participated. He said this in a letter to Goldstein. And Goldstein, you'll find, says that in his book. And yet, what came out was attributed solely to one man, and the attributions or credits or whatever you like were never attended to later. Hence the kinds of ways in which we now describe machines. What was described in that slide I had just a while ago there, a stored program machine in 1944, January 44, although that machine was never built, the concept was described, and if you like, that was of a Neumann machine. Well, we never met with Neumann at that time. So call it what you will. There is some problem, I notice, with people, they say flexible programming. Well, I say that applies to the ENIAC, as I said a moment ago. If that's just another name for storing the program, well, we'll have to set up the definitions, you know. And finally, there's some people that think you should keep the two kinds of storage separate, the data and the instructions. But Neumann felt that way. The program, the things that he worked out at the time we were with him, were always worrying about, be sure you identify which things are instructions. I felt the other way, and a lot of other people did too. I thought that it was the business of the programmer, but I've talked it over recently, and maybe we're coming back to that cautious thing where we'd rather have the machine know when it's trespassing, you might say, and interpreting data as instructions and things of that sort, by accident usually. So the last thing in Eckert's talk here is that his last contact with von Neumann occurred in 1955, just before finalizing the design of the EDVAC Lark. Actually, we were in the middle of a disagreement between Edward Teller and von Neumann on a particular point. Teller took the position that he wanted to get all of the memory in the Lark that their budget would allow. This turned out to be 20,000 words. We later built a Lark with 30,000 words in it for the Bureau of Ships. But anyway, von Neumann contended that putting anything more than 10,000 words in the computer would always be a waste of money. And Teller shouldn't waste the government's money by contracting for a Lark with more than 10,000 words. But Teller prevailed. Which isn't surprising, since he was more directly interested in the project than was von Neumann. Today, of course, we have machines with memories of millions of words in them. And I remember Richard Bellman, in an article he wrote many years before, had million-word memories, stressing the need for larger internal memories to do his kind of programming. Well, that, I think, pretty well winds it up. I've got lots and lots of extra data here. What I'm trying to do, as was Eckert, trying to put before you things that you don't normally find in the literature. And I think the moral of all this is the alert to historians and others that you've got to be careful about the attributions and the interpretations of these words as they change with time. And we've, some of these things were so obvious. For instance, putting a timing track on a drum was mentioned the other day in one of the talks here. We thought that was so obvious, but it's included in this January 44 disclosure. And it seems to me that has something to do with what Kite Sharpless and Technitrol finally collected money on in the way of a patent, putting timing tracks on a drum. Well, I think better let you have any questions you want. And
I see Cuthbert Hurd has a question.
Cuthbert Hurd. I said the other day that Neumann became an IBM consultant, and he actually did that for 30 days a year, and I always spent that 30 days each year with him, so we talked about many things. I never heard him make the claim that he invented stored program. I heard him describe many times meetings with a group of other people, which included John and Presper, in which he made statements like, I went to the board and wrote down maybe summaries of these conversations or ideas. But I never really heard him make the claim, and I think it's perfectly consistent with some of the things you say. On the second point, Nat has up his hand, and I don't know whether Nat's going to talk about this, but during those days of consulting, there's a question about the amount of high-speed memory versus the amount of low-speed memory. And he was always pushing us towards small amounts of core memory and large amounts of magnetic drum memory to back it up, and when you're able to program in your head and write 100 instructions like he could in his head, maybe that's the way to do it. But it wasn't the way to do it for the market that was then apparent.
Right.
Nat Rochester, IBM. Could you give me a couple of dates? When did the ENIAC first run a program, and when did you ship it, or what dates do you have that are like that?
well, I'm not the best possible person to ask exact dates. It ran test programs of various sorts in 1945, before the advent of Nick Metropolis and Stan Frankel, who came up there to give it the real test, you might say, the big one. And they can tell you more than I, for instance, of just exactly what happened with them and how well it happened and those things. The machine stayed in Philadelphia for over a year, and most of that time was considered to be under test. Then it was delivered to Aberdeen and set up by some more skilled engineers who tested it again, and they claimed that it worked very well. Then it was turned over to Aberdeen, and they started turning the tubes on and off every night, and apparently they had real trouble that way.
Because of time, we'll limit it to one more question. This gentleman's been for a while.
Okay. Don Knuth from Stanford. Can you elaborate a little more about the iconoscope and the connection with Williams?
Well, I wish Eckert were here. He could elaborate a lot more. But let me say that there were things called the Moore School Lectures in 1946, summer of 1946. And Eckert and I and Kite Sharpless and Brad Shepard and some other people all contributed to trying to tell the world, anybody that was eligible there and interested, what we thought were the best ways of trying to design these high-speed computers. And so Dr. Wilkes, for instance, was there. I think Williams arrived a little later. But this iconoscope business, we had, in this case, Eckert had some very good ideas about how you could make cathode ray tubes serve as memories and storage devices. And we at Eckert and Mauchly carried on extensive tests of such things as a sort of insurance or backstop, while Brad Shepard and others were developing the acoustic memory, which, as someone has told you, Turing said wouldn't work. Well, Goldstein puts that in his book too. Turing said, you can't get acoustic delay lines to work as a storage. But, as Goldstein says, fortunately, although he convinced us that that was the truth and we didn't go in that direction, in actuality, why, other people did make them work. And there are many people here who did.
Thank you very much, Don.
Yes. That's exactly